thank you very much, everyone, for coming. It's been a good turnout, and thank you for Celine for coming up as well.
My pleasure.
First off, just be good to get an idea of who in the audience has a project that they're, in whatever form, it could be an idea, it could be a finished script that they're trying to move forward. Does anyone have a project they're trying to move forward? Yay! Yeah, it's true, who hasn't? It's good to hear. So this talk is really geared towards that, about how we're going to help ourselves individually and collectively to drive these things forward with the help of the vast experience of Celine. And just to let you know, we've got about 30 minutes of chat and then 30 minutes of Q&A. So if you do have a question, put it in your back pocket and save it for the 30-minute section. Welcome.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you guys for being here tonight.
Thank you for being here. I think the best thing to start off with would be at the beginning. So I briefly know this, but can you talk to us about your life before the decision to make your first feature? What was the spark that made you decide to do it, and what was the whole process?
Absolutely. So before I worked in film, I actually worked for a TV company in New York called HBO. And it was an extraordinary company at the time. It was the heyday of HBO because there were no competitors. So it was when HBO had Sopranos and Sex and the City and Oz and The Wire, and there was no one else making that kind of content. So I was working for a company I was very, very proud to be working for, but I was working in the wrong job, or not the job that I wanted to do. I was working in business development and marketing, and what I really wanted to do was make the content. So I got to know people while I was working there, and it was an extraordinary time in terms of networking and basically meeting people in the industry. And I think this is fabulous tonight because I can't say how many people that I met at that time, which was 22 years ago, 25 years ago, that are now my contemporaries, my colleagues, the people making films. Like, it's these relationships, you guys will, your careers will develop in parallel, and it's fabulous to meet people in the early days of pulling projects together. So anyway, I was at HBO, but what I really wanted to do was to produce, and I spent all this time trying to meet producers, trying to meet writers, directors, and I met two young women who were producers. They'd made a couple of tiny films, and I approached them and I said, I know how to write a business plan, and I think I'm good at raising money. I've never made a film, but I work for HBO. I know lots of people. Can we partner, and can we look to make movies together? And what I think I bring to the table is I can try and raise some money for us, and what I'd like to do with you guys is learn from you as producers. And I was very fortunate they said yes. So we started a film production company. I was actually still an employee at HBO at the time, so I had a kind of double life where I was basically doing office hours and then basically doing the film stuff at lunch and weekends and evenings. So we started our film production company, and then we said, what should we do now that we're film producers? And we said we had to find scripts. So we went out in the world, in New York, and tried to meet young creatives, and we read as much as possible. We were reading books, reading scripts, reading articles, just trying to find basically any source of content. And there's a very fun bakery in New York, downtown New York, called Magnolia Bakery, where they sell very good cupcakes. And there was a guy working at the cupcake store behind the counter who said, I've got a script. And at that time, we would read anything. If anyone had a script, we would read it. So his name was Jim, and he gave us a script. It was called Lonesome Jim, and it was basically about himself, and it was about basically a loser who comes to New York to try and make it, but he can't make it in New York, and instead he's working in the cupcake store, and everything fails, and he has to go back, embarrassed, his hometown in Indiana, move back in with his parents, and he's failed in New York. And it's about him kind of ultimately starting a life again back home and accepting his failure and kind of finding peace with himself. We read the script and we loved it, and we thought it was really funny. And in reading it, it made us think of Steve Buscemi. There was something about the kind of sad sack kind of main character that felt like it embodied the humor and the self-deprecating nature of Steve Buscemi. So we thought, why don't we send it to Steve Buscemi? But then we had to get to Steve Buscemi, and Hollywood and actors is full of gatekeepers, as I'm sure you know. It's very, very hard, boundaries and basically to break, and hard hurdles to get over. So we called Steve Buscemi's agent's assistant and pitched him the idea of the project. And this was kind of another life, there's many life lessons along the way of this story, but one life lesson is be nice to everybody. And we were very, very nice to this assistant who usually gets yelled at, and the assistant said he would read the script for us, and he read it, and he called us back and said, "This script makes me think of Steve Buscemi." So we thought, oh. So we thought, we're onto something. And then he gave the script to his boss, who is still Steve Buscemi's representative today, all these years later. And the Steve Buscemi's agent read it and called us and said, "This script makes me think of Steve Buscemi." And then he said, "Would you like to meet with him?" And we said yes. And we went to Brooklyn and sat down with Steve Buscemi. And he said, "I love this script. It feels like it was written for me." So we were thrilled. And then Steve said, "I want to direct it. I want to give it to 3 people with your blessing. I want to give it to Casey Affleck to play Jim, to play the main guy. I want to give it to Liv Tyler to play the love interest who he meets, who's a nurse when he goes back home to Indiana. And then I want to give it to my favorite studio, United Artists, because I think this is exactly the kind of film they want to make." Wow. He gave it to those 3 people, and they all said yes. And I thought, producing is so easy. This is the best job in the world. United Artists said they'd give us $5 million, which is a lot today, but it was really a lot back then. So we closed Steve Buscemi's deal, and we were going to pay him $500,000, 10% of the budget, to direct the film. And really, he was directing, he was producing, he was pulling the whole thing together. And we closed his deal, and we were starting prep 2 weeks later. This is before the internet and news spread as quickly as it does today. And we used to get physical trades. So we used to get Hollywood Reporter and Variety basically in physically on the Monday morning. And the Monday morning, which was 2 weeks out from starting prep, we got Hollywood Reporter, and front page of Hollywood Reporter said, "United Artists shuts down." And suddenly this Go movie that had been so easy to pull together suddenly was, basically falling apart. And Casey Affleck had a hard out. He basically had to shoot at a certain date because he was going off to do Ocean's 12. So if we didn't go into prep right away, we would lose our star, and the whole thing would, basically kind of crumble into pieces. So we had 2 weeks to find the money. And we went and called everyone under the sun, every production company, every financier. We knocked on doors, we begged, and there was a teeny tiny company in downtown New York called Cinetic, the bigger company was called Cinetic, but the division was called Indigent. And Indigent, it was the early days of digital film on these, kind of tiny little cameras where, it kind of doesn't look that good. It's really evolved since, but they made us an offer of using basically their digital cameras, and they would put in $350,000 to fully finance the film. So in moments, our budget had gone from $5 million to $350K, and most importantly, our budget was smaller than our director's fee. It was really our only choice, and Steve said yes, we basically had to renegotiate every deal. Everyone's deal had to be renegotiated. And the Indigent model, which is really interesting and kind of slightly communist, was that basically everyone was paid $100 a day, from Liv Tyler to the PAs. So everyone had the same day rate, and then everyone had ownership in the film. So basically everyone had points, and the movie star had more points, and the PAs had a tiny little bit of the back end, but everyone basically profited from the film in success. Every single person stuck with the film. We had to change locations. We were going to shoot it, basically closer to New York. Instead, we actually went to Indiana, and we shot it in the house of the filmmaker to cut our locations costs. And we all stayed in a bed and breakfast in Indiana. And essentially, Indiana ended up being a great decision because it was so cheap to shoot there. And then we made the day in 16 days, which was less press days than Liv Tyler at the time got on most of her films. So this was my second kind of big lesson in producing, was you make a plan and you try and make a great plan, and then if your plan falls apart, you have to change your plan and pivot really quickly. We made the film. The film is lovely. It doesn't look great. It's kind of early digital, but it got into Sundance and it sold decently. It sold to IFC in the US, and it sold all over the world. It got a big France sale. It won a couple of prizes along the way, and it launched Jim Strauss, the cupcake seller who no longer makes cupcakes. He now is a successful writer-director. It launched his career. We made the next 2 films with him after that. And then it launched our career. We were basically filming Sundance, and then we got the next film made the next year, and we basically got going. So I think that's there's lots of lessons there in terms of, basically you look for projects everywhere. You try and find something you really believe in. You think about what are the strategic pieces that build the value of this, because you start off, it's basically 100 pages of paper, and that is something that you need to, in the industry, have it stand out. And how do you have it stand out? You have it stand out by having a director people will pay attention to, or a piece of casting, or a piece of financing. Like, how do you build what this is to get it closer to production? And I think that's really the job of the producers. You're pushing huge rocks up hills every day, and at any point the rock can come, kind of rolling down on you and crush you, but that is your job to push and to keep pushing.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah. What a story. A lot of interesting gems there. Would you say, that was my next question, is having done the film, how did it change your career and what did you learn? Would you say that the fundamental thing you learned is about pivoting?
Yeah, pivoting is definitely a very, very, really, really good plans, and then willingness to pivot is a very big one. I think that when you're making films, you always set out with what is your dream? What is your dream talent involved? What is your dream budget? What is your dream way of making it? And the reality is the dream very rarely pans out, because the reality is, you're out in the industry and the project doesn't have as much value as you'd hope it has. You can't raise the money you want. You can't shoot in the location you want. So you have to make a great plan and then really be willing to, pivot and compromise. And then also fight for the things that really matter. Like on every project, there are certain things. We did a movie that's out on Netflix right now called Unicorns, which is Sally El-Hosseini and James Floyd's. She's directed a couple of times, but it's their first time co-directing. And it was a low-budget film. We had very, very little money for that, but they had things that were important to them. They really wanted to shoot in Manchester for a few days. They really wanted to cast authentically for the drag queen, which is it's an LGBT love story, and they wanted one of the characters. So it was basically first-time actor in one of the roles. So there were certain things that we really talked about what matters to you, what are the things you want to protect. But for everything else, we have to compromise. We have to cut days. We have to, not get all the things we want, but let's fight and protect the things that really matter.
It sounds like there's conflict between the business side and the creative. Where do you find yourself on that spectrum? Do you find more joy in the spreadsheets and things like that, or in more of the creative?
I definitely find more joy in the creative, but I believe that the job of the film producer is to do both. You're ultimately responsible. I think that you have to fight to realize the creative vision and make it the absolute best it can be. Your job is to, basically have this be the best thing it can in terms of performance, in terms of the look, in terms of the sound, in terms of music, and every aspect of putting the movie together. But you also have a fiscal responsibility, and when you take money from investors, I think film has a very bad reputation with investors, and very often people lose money on films, or movies go over budget, and things go wrong. Movies are left unfinished. There's litigation. There's just so many horror stories for investors. So I think part of our joint responsibility is to try and build trust in investors, because we have investors where if they have a good experience, they'll come back and do another film. And it's ultimately, it's not just good for me, but it's good for the ecosystem when investors have a good experience. So I think it's really balancing both those things. And I will say that on some of my movies, constraints have actually led to stronger creative outputs, because sometimes when someone, we see it all the time, there's movies with enormous budgets where, people, it's self-indulgent and there's no discipline in the way that people make films. I made a film a long time ago, I think it was about 12 years ago, called The Kid's All Right, which a film I'm very proud of. And on that film, it was the middle of the financial crisis in the States. Basically, just money had disappeared, and it was, a time where every store was shutting down, restaurants were shutting down, so raising money for film, it was just not where people wanted to put their money. So we went from a $10 million budget that we were targeting to a $4.5 million budget. And as a result, we made all these decisions that in terms of, kind of shooting around one neighborhood in Venice, California, and in terms of casting, we made all these decisions that ultimately, I believe that is the best version of that movie. And if we'd had, 10 times the budget, the movie would not have been better. So I do think sometimes constraints help the creative process.
Yeah, exactly. There's numerous examples where the lack of the budget actually led to a better film in the end. And talking about The Kids Are All Right, how did that change your career? I know that awards are important, festivals are important, but to make a film for a festival or award seems a bit counterintuitive to the creative process. But how did that change your career, and do you sometimes make films to gear them towards distribution to festivals and awards and things like that?
For us, almost every film we do, in our minds, we think it would be great if this was a festival film, and it would be great if this got an award for the actors in it. And the reason it's less about oh, wouldn't it be great to win an award and to make a speech. It's less about that, but it's really just how do you get the film to stand out? And there are thousands of films being made every year, and the way that they stand out so first of all, it's so hard to make the film, but once you've made the film, then there's two other enormous challenges. One challenge is how do you get distribution. We can talk about that separately. And then the next bit of it is how do you get audiences to watch it and to care. And so those things, going to Sundance, going to Toronto, going to Cannes, going to Berlin, going to Toronto, those laurel leaves basically tell the distribution community, and then they tell audiences ultimately, this is something worth watching. And same with awards. So when a movie is fortunate enough to get a BAFTA nomination or an Oscar nomination or Golden Globe nomination, suddenly it is a movie that people watch. And you look at, this year was such an exciting year for independently minded films. And I say independently minded because some of them were actually made within the studio system, but to me, Anora and The Brutalist and The Substance and Amelia Perez, and it was a year of highly, highly, highly distinctive original films, and a few very much kind of low, both Anora and Brutalist were made for under 10 and performed incredibly well. So it's definitely a year of exciting films, in my opinion, but that journey of the festivals and the awards is what ultimately got people to pay attention to those films. For us, with The Kid's All Right, so we put the kids together. It was a script that we read and really fell in love with, and it was Lisa Cholodenko, who's an extraordinary filmmaker, directing, and it kind of came together fairly quickly with Julianne Moore and Annette Bening wanting to play the couple in the film. And then we had a really hard time casting the guy. It was just kind of, it's interesting. I think it's easier to get women to do independent films than the men sometimes, because that age group of men, men in their 30s, 40s, they're so in demand and they're getting, huge paydays for, big action films. But anyway, Mark Ruffalo stepped in really 2 weeks before the shoot, and we're so lucky that he played that role because he's brilliant in it. And we made it, and we did not have high hopes for the film. We thought it would probably be a Sundance film, but we thought it was going to be a film really geared towards the LGBTQIA community, and that would be, its audience. And we screened it, and the movie came out really well. What was great about that movie, it was a movie about a same-sex couple, Julianne Moore and Annette Bening, who have 2 kids who want to find their biological father, and it's about, kind of the chaotic impact when he comes into their lives. And what the strength of that movie is that it was a comedy, and basically it played really, really, really well as a comedy, and the comedy, in a way, kind of from a marketing standpoint, was what was leading over it being a queer film. So we screened it at Sundance, and it was one of those screenings that was just through the roof. It was just people were laughing and clapping in the middle of the film. And I sat on the way out as people were leaving. Actually, just jumping backwards, because this is an important bit of it. When we were pulling the movie together, we needed, because of the way the financing was arranged, we needed distribution, because basically the financing wanted distribution. And there was a company called Overture Films, which belonged at the time to Starz, the TV company. And Overture had come on board, and they were not giving us any money, but they were committing to a 100-screen release. Their company, I guess it's a theme in my career, that company went out of business while we were in prep. And it was terrible, because basically the money had already been sent to us, but it was tied to distribution, and it wasn't going to stay. Basically we were in a very kind of dire straits position without distribution. So we went to every single distributor and we said, you can have this movie for free. All we want is your commitment that you'll release it. And they all said no. Every single one. Focus said no. Searchlight said no. At the time, Warner Independent was a company. They've also shut down. They said no. Everyone said no. So so finally, we managed to convince the investors to stay, and they stayed. We had to cut the budget. We made the film. So I was standing at Sundance outside the screening room, and every distributor came out, and every one of them, one by one, said, I'm buying your movie. I'm buying your movie. I'm buying your movie. And it was 10 people in a row, all of whom had passed on it, who said, I'm buying your movie. And then what continued afterwards was a dizzying 2 days of a bidding war, where basically every one of these companies lined up it was in Sundance, in kind of these big chalets, and they were all in different rooms. And we would go in one room and sit with Harvey, and then talk to him, and then afterwards we'd go and sit with Searchlight, and then we'd sit with Focus, and every one of the companies said, "We're so sorry, we made such a big mistake, we should have said yes." And over those 2 nights, basically, the price went from 2 million to 4 million to 6 million, and we ended up basically selling the world for around 10 million, which we were thrilled about. And ultimately, when we got to 10 million, we thought, at this point, it's not about the money anymore, it's about who the right company is. And then at that point, basically, there were 6 companies left that got to the 10 million number, and we asked them to make a marketing presentation. And and they all came in and they said, this is how we'll market the film. But Focus, who we sold it to, which is a division of Universal, and they're a fantastic company, they had a 30-page presentation. And basically what they said is, our company is designed, we were built to release this film, and this is the way. And there was so much passion involved that basically that was our choice. And then the movie went on to gross 35 million at the box office, and it got, thank you, it won 2 Golden Globes, and it got 4 Oscar nominations. It lost every one of the nominations, but it was okay, we were happy to be there. And it was game-changing for me. The awards were fantastic, but also the other piece that was really important to me is I suddenly saw film for impact, because it was a LGBT film that was marketed as a comedy that people saw and laughed and felt comfortable with and liked the characters, and there was something about, and the audience that came in was a much, much broader audience, and you had people coming out and saying, oh, it's 2 women, but they have the same problems that straight couples have. And it was really interesting to kind of see that it was part of I guess building tolerance for same-sex couple marriage, just at the time where the various American states were discussing legalizing marriage. And so suddenly our film was being referenced in op-ed pages in the New York Times, as the decisions were being made. And same-sex marriage was actually turned down in California that year, and turned down in New York that year, but it went through 2 years later. And I'm not saying the film is what changed things, but our film was part of the conversation. So suddenly it was kind of this eureka moment of films can actually change the way people think, and when people start thinking differently, then years later the rules changed, and there was something about that felt very exciting.
Do you know, I actually have a question. You answered that exact question. Do you think films can have a cultural, social impact and that sort of thing? It's amazing. Going back to the point you sort of parked about distribution, can you explain, how can you explain that 10 of them didn't want it, they see the film, 10 of them are fighting tooth and nail to get it, and then finance wants distribution, no distribution, hard to get finance. Is it sort of a risk averse?
It's actually really interesting question. So basically, there's 2 parts to that. One is it's all about films are execution dependent. When you're making a Marvel movie, it's less execution dependent because everyone knows what that concept is. Everyone understands what it's going to be. It's very, very, very clear. And also, those studios can just throw money at them. So if the movies are not working, they can go and do 2 months of reshoot and another year of edit. So those films are less execution dependent. If you're making a $2 million film, about a woman climbing the Himalayas by herself and just how hard it is to overcome a mountain by yourself, that is execution dependent. No one knows, is that going to be absolutely riveting, or is that just not going to interest audiences at all? So the films that I tend to make, which tend to be dramas and small, tend to all be execution dependent. And so what that means for a distributor is they would rather wait and see the finished film, and they would rather pay 10 times the amount that they would pay if they said yes on day 1, or 5 times, or twice as much, and take that risk, and also the risk ultimately of not getting the film, because they could have said yes and then they might not get it down the line, but they would rather do it that way because they would rather overpay for films they know work rather than pay for lots of films that may or may not work. And then another piece of it is really to do with the distributors or the studio's business capacity to take on films, like how many films every one of these films taking it on is a cost of their team and their focus, and it's, so for them, they would rather do less and make sure that basically they're taking bets on films that really work. And the distribution community has become harder and harder and harder for so many reasons. There are less of these distributors around, and then the distributors that are around are really, really struggling. It's incredibly expensive to release a film, less people going to see independent films. And then something else that has happened in the last few years, which is really tricky for distributors, is the streamers arrived, and the streamers were building their library, and they were building, basically all this content. So they were paying a lot of money for the film rights right after the theatrical release. So all these companies like Roadside Attraction, which is a really good US distributor, they had a deal with Hulu. Magnolia had a deal with Netflix. Like all these companies had deals, and those deals, for example, were $400,000 to $500,000 per title. So that allowed that distributor to then go and buy the film and release the film and pay for marketing, knowing that they had the streaming deal. The streamers now have evolved, and they're now far more into series than they are into film. And when they are into film, they want them to be big event films. They're making their own films. Netflix budgets have gone, from smaller budgets. Now they're making $100 to $250 million films. So they're not interested in that kind of second window distributor business, and it has really, really hurt the distribution community. So it's a struggle right now, distribution. Did I answer all your questions?
Talking to that struggle, where do you see the future heading for this space?
Well, it's really hard right now, and I'll not to be too negative, but I think it's a very, what's happened in the industry in the last 5 years. So first COVID, so there was basically a shutdown in production, and there was also a real shutdown in the exhibition community. And what did happen is people started watching streaming or getting more streaming services. So at the time, there were 2 streaming services per home at the beginning of COVID. And by the end of COVID, there were 4 streaming services per home. So suddenly people watching everything at home, and there was very good content made on the streamers. And so when the world slowly reopened up, particularly for independent films, which, are often geared towards, kind of art house, sophisticated audience, age 40 plus, that audience was the audience that was still nervous about COVID, didn't really want to be in theaters and big communal spaces, so they didn't go back. And they haven't really, really properly gone back, till now. I feel like it's a glimmer of hope in the independent theatrical space, but it took years. So after COVID, production did rebound, and 2021 was a really strong production year, which was great. And then there was the double strike. So basically there were 2 strikes in a row that basically was one whole year of nothing shooting at all, 2023. And the assumption was that after the double strike, all these films would go into production, all this financing would flow towards films, and basically the industry would come back up in the way that it had after COVID. But during the double strike, what ended up happening, the double strike cost the studios and cost the film industry so much money that basically companies were shutting down. So basically companies were shutting down, and companies were consolidating, and they were basically cutting. So people were losing their jobs. The companies that were still around were losing 25% of their staff and 25% of their budgets. So by the time you got out of the double strike, it was an industry that was basically barely on its feet, and production just never came back up. So it was basically it was finished around November 2023, and production never recovered. So the whole year of 2024 was essentially a dead year in film, where very little happened. And everyone, the motto was wait for 2025, wait for 2025. It's going to be good in 2025. And then 2025 comes around, and then there were the LA fires, which were just another factor of, kind of another big pain for the city of LA, and another thing that, basically was distracting people, rightly so. It was a really horrendous thing. And the industry has not recovered in 2025. So it's a really, really hard time to get anything made or anything distributed. Where I think the opportunity is, and I think it's an opportunity for me and for everyone in this room, is to be nimble. And I think, that's where the studios can't be nimble. They have a huge, machine in how they make films, and it's expensive for them to make films, and they have to make films a certain way, and they have to make films for 4 quadrants that, release on 3,000, 4,000 screens. We can be nimble. We can make, we have a film we're putting together right now, and we're trying to get it financed, and we are talking to people. It's actually 3 movies. It's kind of a film sequence, a film series of, basically 3 romantic films that pick up a relationship at 3 different times. We are talking to people about doing it as a TV series. We're talking to people about doing it as a web series. We're talking to people about doing it as a normal film. And I think it's such a nimble time, and the industry has really consolidated where, you can look at a script or a book, and is it a web series? Is it a film? Is it an ongoing series? Is it a limited series? There's so many ways to tell stories. So I think it's a real moment of opportunity about being nimble and being willing to be flexible about how you tell it, and finding paths. And I think it's also a good moment for experimentation. And we had a film a couple of years ago called Skin, where we made a short film before we made the feature film, and the short film is what got the traction to get the feature film made, and that kind of thing, kind of being open to different paths. I feel like that is a stronger possibility now than it ever was.
So does that mean you're an advocate for proof of concepts, these sort of things that can help get a project over the line?
Absolutely, especially for young filmmakers. If it's first time or second time filmmaker, to be able to, what I would recommend actually is to take a scene from the feature, just find either a scene or something that thematically is similar, and think about who do you want ultimately as the actors in your feature, and can you find a way to convince them, come and just do one day on this and let's do a short, and really have the proof of concept, the short film, be as close as possible to what you want to make, because then you have something that you can really show people in the community, and for them to say, okay, I see what you're trying to do. We talked about execution dependent. I think if you can do a short that really is thematically, that takes away kind of one of the questions about execution, because people can really see what it is you're trying to do. And then I think the more, as filmmakers, the more you have to show, the more it'll reassure whoever it is that you're talking to, whether you're talking to cast or to crew or to financiers or to distributors. So if you have a great deck, if you have a great statement, if the script obviously has got to be incredibly strong, but if you have all the other things, there's a filmmaker I've worked with a couple of times in America called Maggie Betts, who we made her first film, which won Sundance, and then she's had one huge studio offer after the other since then. But she would make decks for every aspect of the film. So she would make a story deck, then she would do a deck on cinematography, she would do a deck on production design, she'd do a deck on costume design. And it was really extraordinary watching her in meetings, because she would be meeting, let's say, an actor, and they'd say, tell me about the look of the film. And she'd be like, one moment. And then she would open basically a 20-page document and be able to walk through, this is how it's going to look, and this is how the costumes are going to be, and this is how the makeup's going to be. And you could see that actors would interact with her and say, oh, I'm in such good hands. This is someone who has thought of every single thing and has prepped every single thing. So that's how she got her first movie made. It was with Margaret Qualley and Melissa Leo, and we sold it to Sony. And then her second film that we made, we did with Amazon, and her career has just skyrocketed because of the sheer amount of preparation that she puts into films.
Sounds like the word there is confidence, instilling confidence in others about the project. So, turning to you, the last question before we hand it over to the audience. You have 8 or 9 projects in various stages of development at the moment. Everything from musical, Christmas Karma, to Scarlett Johansson's directorial debut, to And Son with Bill Nighy. I mean, there's such a breadth of material. What do you as a producer look for when something comes across you? In terms of script, is there anything that turns you off?
Well, we tend to want to put positive messages in the world, so we typically haven't done horror or something too negative. Not that I don't think that, that genre is incredibly financially successful, it does very well, and audiences really want to see it, so I'm not saying anyone should do as I do, but it just tends to not be the thing we're most drawn to. We like things that, kind of have positive cultural impact. We tend to like female skewing, whether it's behind the camera or in front of the camera. And it's really lovely when a film tackles something that we think is a societal challenge or problem, and that you think that by making this film you could be part of the conversation. And then really for us it's about, you live with these things, they're like your children. You live with them for years and years and years, and you have to raise them and put them out in the world, and they're badly behaved, and it's so hard. So you look for something that you have to love it so much, because you take on a project and all day long people are going to say, no, your project's no good, no, no, no. And so you have to have that love of, kind of wanting to see it through be so strong. So it's really about, kind of passion. And then for us often, as I've been doing this for a long time, but it also becomes around the team, because it's really hard making movies, and there are a lot of fights, there's a lot of disagreements, and so you have to, the people that you're, that in the foxhole with you, you have to think, you're basically fighting for a writer, and you're fighting for a director, and you're fighting for the team, and it's got to be people where you feel like, okay, it's worth it, it's worth the fight, and it's worth, and that also that you're going to be aligned, because I think sometimes on projects this is another, I guess, kind of life lesson, is I've made films where we've only found out sometimes months into working together that actually the director thought we were making a drama, but I thought we were making a comedy, or there's times where you're absolutely not aligned. And I actually, I made a studio movie where the director thought she was making something, and the studio thought they were making something, and they only found out halfway through the shoot that they completely disagreed on. So anyway, I think good communication, really being aligned, and the person being someone you want to really fight for. Like, to me, those are all the things that are important for me.
Thank you. Over to you guys. Does anyone have any questions? We've got about half an hour for questions, so we'll just pass the mic over. Let's start with Ollie. Would you be able to?
I can just speak loud if you want.
Okay.
I'm an AD, it's fine. So, hello. It's not so much of a question, it's kind of like a vague ballpark. There might be a question built in there, so I've just made a short, and my DP was saying to me he's worried that when we go to make the feature, he's going to get the elbow, because I'll be a first-time director, and he'll be a first-time DP going on to the feature, and he wants to protect himself from that. I'd love to protect him, I'd love to bring him onto the feature. I feel like talent is more the concern when it comes to distribution and sales and getting finance, and not so much the DP. I hope that's the case. So that's kind of like the first part of the question. And then the second part is just if you could just talk about going to the streamers and trying to get budget from the streamers in the sort of non-traditional ways, and not going for theatrical as an indie, because indie theatrical these days is almost dead. So kind of, yeah, I mean, you tell me, but that's kind of it really.
With regards to the first thing, so when there's a first-time director, they often like the team around to be very, very experienced, for it to be really experienced, DP, first AD, editor, kind of everyone around to be, so that there's, I guess, a safety net around. But if you and the DP are really, really close and speak the same language and it works really well together, that's when you can make an argument, basically to bring that person on, that this is someone, where we have shorthand, we understand each other, we want the same thing. But ultimately, it'll be so much around the short. And if people see beautiful work, I think people will be willing to make that leap of faith on, basically the two of you together.
Sorry?
I'll tell you. Yeah. And then, so I think in this day and age, when I started, all we wanted was theatrical. Like, theatrical, the dream. You make these movies because you want to be in a theater and for people to see your film on the big screen with surround sound. Like, that is the dream. It's very, very hard to get audiences to go to the theater, and particularly for something that is not an event, DC, Star Wars type of film. So we made a movie with Maggie Gyllenhaal a couple of years ago, which was kind of a tough topic. It's called The Kindergarten Teacher, and it's about a woman who obsesses over a child that is in her class and ends up kidnapping him, and it's quite dark and complicated. And none of the theatrical distributors wanted it, but Netflix came and said that they wanted it, and we sold it to Netflix, and it was seen by 6 million households in the first month of release. And we thought a little bit about that. We could have sold it to, let's say, IFC Films, and it would have come out in New York, LA, and 5 people would have seen it in each place. There is something about basically the scale that you get. It was kind of extraordinary. Netflix, it switches on the Friday everywhere around the world. The whole world sees it, in a minute, in an instant. And you really, I don't think anyone has ever seen a film as quickly, like just anecdotally when you're talking to people, they're like, oh, I saw it, like everyone saw it. So I think it's a really, it's a path worth considering. They are not buying or making independent film like they used to. So when I started conversations with Netflix, they were making a lot. They were making, at the time, they were making 40 movies in the 5 million and under range. So they basically were just building their content. So they were making these romantic comedies. They were making, just these lots and lots of little films. And that business has gone away. And they still occasionally make a little film, but that has been replaced by, basically the tentpole films they make. So they're less in the business of little films, but I think if you can get them to say yes to your project, whether it's now or when it's finished as an acquisition, it's definitely a path worth considering. Although for me, still my heart is in theatrical, and I would pick theatrical over streaming if I could.
Who's next? Because I can see your hand. Yes. Yep.
Hello. Thank you so much for this evening. It's been really educational. I actually know nothing about producing, so it's been lovely to hear you and to learn. I've just done my first short film, acting in it, and the director's really excited to kind of push it out to all the festivals when it's ready. I was just curious to hear your thoughts on the future of short films, because I've just seen that Jason Isaacs and Emma Darcy, they've just done a short film together. And I was just as someone that has a wealth of experience in producing and has done some short films as well, where we are now, 2025, if you could expand where you think the future of short films is going, just interested in that.
I don't know if I have expertise in that, but I will say I think that young people are watching shorts more than ever. It's this kind of thing they watch on their phone, as they're commuting, as they're walking, as they're waiting on the underground. And I think mostly shorts are such an extraordinary showcase for every for the writer, for the director, for the crew, for the actors, and getting those shorts on the festival circuit and getting seen as widely as possible, and kind of representatives, whether it's actors representative, director representative, they are watching these short films, they're signing people off it. It's so competitive, the agency world, so they are going after the talent from short films, and I think that's the reason to make a short is to be able to ultimately make a feature that is a longer version of it, but it's also for the talent and to get the talent signed and launched on their career. Thank you.
Just to add to that, I think Ethan Hawke and Pedro Pascal were in Alejandro González Iñárritu. He did a short film last year, so it even happens at the top. Ultimately, it's just about telling stories, I think.
What was the budget for that?
I think it was pretty big.
John?
Yeah, my question's like a chicken and egg sort of question. And it goes back to your first story about your first film, which started out with a $5 million budget and ended up with $350,000. But you secured the names with the $5 billion. How important was that? And how important are names in your films?
So, names help, a lot. But names are hard to get.
Yeah.
And it is very much a chicken and egg. When I started with, I would say, my first 10 films, you'd go to actors and they'd say, but is it financed?
Yeah.
And your film was not financed, and therefore they'd say, well, I'm not going to give it to Sam Rockwell because your film is not financed. And then you go to the financing and they'd say, who's your cast? And you'd say, nobody. And then they'd say, well, I'm not giving you money because you don't have anyone in your cast. So that is a really, really, really tricky dance. And I'm not advising anyone to lie, but I think there's a gray zone of basically, and the gray zone is you will the project into happening, and what you tell the cast is, yes, there's interested financing, and what you tell the financing is, yes, there's interested cast, and somehow it's the magic of, kind of pulling all of that together. It's very hard, it's very, very, very hard, because what ends up happening is financing don't really take projects seriously unless they're a go, and to be a go, you need really, the cast and the team. And yes, it very, very much is a chicken and egg, but I think what I try to do is I plant a flag. So I say, this movie is going into prep August 1st, and it is shooting September 15th in London. It is happening. It is a train that's leaving the station. And you try and get people to believe that, and you have those conversations with the cast, and you have the conversations with the financing, you kind of hope that it all jumps together. I would say one other tip on casting, which is something that I never thought about till there was an agent at CA who called me, and he said, what your problem is, Celine? You're always thinking about what the actor can do for your project, how the actor coming onto your project will help you. You have to change your thinking. You have to think about how will your project help the actor. And it was so illuminating. I was like, oh wow, that's a really interesting, to not put myself first, but to put them first. And what it started making me think is, who needs this movie? Why is, so Renée Zellweger is not going to come and do my low budget romantic comedy. She has no reason to. She can do that in Bridget Jones. But is there an actor who's funny but is never offered comedy? Or is there someone whose career is in the doldrums for whatever reason, where we would often on Monday mornings think about whose movie did not perform this weekend, who's just had a really, really bad flop, and no one is calling that person. And why don't we be the ones to call that person and say, hey, you're interested in this? Or, I think going against type, like that's something that we just went out to a huge, huge actress. She's actually a TV actress, but we went to her with something where she said she gets only offered comedy. We went to her with something, kind of very thrilling and dramatic. And she said, no one has ever offered me something in this genre before. I cannot believe you thought of me for that. I'm so flattered. And for her, it was an opportunity to get outside the genre that she does. or it's thinking, who cares about this, if your movie is a sort of mission statement film, is there someone who cares about this topic? A movie about adoption, is there an actor who has adopted and that's an important part of their life, they might want to tell that story? Or is there someone that would enjoy coming and spend a month in the UK? Or, what do you have to bring to the actor as opposed to the other way around?
Thinking about Matthew McConaughey, it's a sort of relaunch.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Who's next? Tonya.
Hi.
Hi.
Brilliant. Everything. Now that we're kind of a recovery, not necessarily thriving in 2025, but sort of getting back on. In terms of finding new projects for you and finding new scripts, you were talking a lot about shorts, and I completely see that and agree with that. Going to the bigger festivals, even theater performances like Baby Reindeer and even Fleabag and things like that. Where do you see that still happening and increasing in terms of going to Sundance and going to a shorts program and saying, hey, like not finding like a project that's already done and being like, okay, let's just distribute it, but finding something that needs to be developed? Is that kind of back on the tick? That's getting sort of bigger, right? Like that's a nice way in. I think that's in terms of like being actually able to make something of quality.
I fully agree. I think Edinburgh Fringe is something really worth looking at in terms of things taking off. That's where Baby Reindeer launched. Making it a great short that gets kind of big buzz online, like that when a short really works, there's a frenzy of kind of producers and various people wanting to be involved in that. So it's about kind of everyone from the studio standpoint and the streamer standpoint. Everyone is chasing the hot thing. There was a play this year at Edinburgh called Weather Girl that the industry went nuts over. And that had a bidding war. Every single one of the streamers went after it, and the guy who had written it basically was able to sell it with everything that he wanted. Basically he's writing it, directing it, his girlfriend starring, like every single thing he wanted, he got.
I can't believe a guy wrote that. I saw that over at Soho and I was like, no way she didn't write that, but that's brilliant, yeah.
He's a super talented writer. But yeah, so Edinburgh Fringe, short films, and it's, really just, kind of, I guess it's making that thing, the thing of the zeitgeist, the thing of the moment that, basically people want. It's hard to manufacture. It's really, I think it's often about, something being either really topical. In the case of The Weather Girl, I was touching on, well, actually, I guess it got the buzz. It had an environmental aspect. It actually had fires, which ended up being, sadly, incredibly relevant months later, but it felt like it was kind of the zeitgeist. So it's something being kind of topical, and also people really seeing clearly. Oh, I see in this short film what it would be like if it were made to be longer.
My question is short. If you have like a BAFTA-nominated short, is there a kind of window after that you have to kind of get it made into a feature? Does it kind of die after a certain time? Do you have to be like?
I mean, I think with anything like that, people do like the new. So I think for anything like that, you want, if it's fantastic, a BAFTA-nominated short. I think the year after that would be the year to really, really be knocking on all doors and trying to, and not to say that it couldn't happen, 2-3 years down the line, but I think the first year after is the year to really try and get.
Make those connections,
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll have one in the front.
Yeah, thanks so much. I have two questions which are a bit vague. First is, do you have any suggestions to women in film industries nowadays in terms of everything, like in terms of how they see themselves, in terms of how they face different situations? Yeah, and the second question is, I know you mentioned a little bit about how to get the trust of the investors by fully prepared and prepare different kinds of decks in different perspectives. But do you have any other suggestions in terms of how to negotiating with investors to get the funding, especially for new filmmakers?
I'll start with the second question because the first one's a bit more complicated. But the funding advice is actually very similar to the advice that I just gave about casting, which is I go into investor meetings and I think about why would this person want to invest? What is it that I should bring to the table? And the truth is investors invest for so many different reasons. So it's to do with really researching who the person is. So some of my investors are very finance focused. So I come into those meetings with a finance plan. I come in with a spreadsheet. I model different, this is what it looks like if the movie really works. This is a mid-case scenario, and this is the scenario where the movie doesn't work, and here's the return on investment in all those models. And that conversation is purely finance-driven. There's also the investor that loves the themes of the film, and you explain to them, I'm making a movie about postnatal depression because that's a huge, it has a huge negative impact on the female population, and we want to lift the shame on this topic and people to feel comfortable talking about this topic. And on that, we did a movie, it was called A Mouthful of Air with Amanda Seyfried about postnatal depression. Every single one of the investors had either suffered personally or their wives or sisters. It was all basically people who had been impacted by it. And that's how we got, the movie was, a very dark and difficult, traumatic film, but we got it financed because people related to the topic. I also have investors who want their child to, their teen or early 20s child to be working on the set, and they're doing it for them. Or I have investors who have kind of not that interesting a day job, and for them film it's really fun to come on set and meet the movie star. Or there's so many different reasons. So it's basically finding out what's of importance to them, and then how can you sell them on basically achieving the thing that they're looking to do. I find investors really like honesty, and in terms of kind of the promises you make on how the movie performs. So I try to be very cautious in what I present financially, because I think that kind of over-promising, basically saying, oh, you're going to make 5 times your money, you're probably not, and you want that person to be happy with the outcome. So I generally tell my investors, I don't think film is a good investment. It's not a great industry from a return standpoint. However, if you love film, I'm a trustworthy person to do it with. I will tell you the truth. I will run this project well, and we will do the best that we can. And that's been a good approach with investors, because they like not being overpromised from a return standpoint. And then the last thing I will say on investors is a potential investor can be anywhere, and it takes lots and lots and lots of meetings to find them. So I tend to, I meet lots of investors, and so many of those meetings don't lead to anything. But if someone tells me, oh, a friend of mine's interested in investing in film, I always take that meeting, knowing that 9 out of 10 times it won't amount to anything. But I think it's so hard to find money for film, so it's a big part of the job. Women in film. So it was very, very hard to be a woman in film when I started. It was an incredibly, sexist industry in every way, in terms of how you were treated in the workplace, but also the outlook on making films. So it was a time where in America, only 4% of films were directed by women, only 2% of cinematographers were women. It was just, the prospects of being a woman in film, and, female-driven films were not being made. And once in a while, there'd be a female-driven film, like Bridesmaids, and people say, oh my God, women like, people will like movies about women, and they'd be really shocked, and then they wouldn't make one for 2 years. So it was very hard. And then there was cataclysmic events in Me Too, Time's Up, and Black Lives Matter, which happened in 2017, and then Black Lives Matter in 2020. And suddenly there was a huge change in the workspace and how people were treated, how women were treated, how people of color were treated, and then, but also a big, big change in who was allowed to tell what stories, and what stories did people want to tell, and how were people casting those movies. So I think that those things, those two societal changes have been incredibly helpful, but are we where we want to be? Absolutely not. I still think, women are discriminated against every day on a film set, in the making films. I think it's very, very hard. I think that women have to work harder to build the trust of, I can handle it. Like, that's a question that comes up all the time when I'm working with female directors, even very experienced female directors, like someone who's made 2 or 3 films. People will ask, studios will ask, investors will ask, but can she handle it? Can she handle a 100-person crew? Can she handle, the pressure? And I think women, in a way, have to present. That's why I talked about the preparation and the decks. I think that a woman has to. I've worked with some male directors who come into the meeting and they're like, I guess we'll cast so-and-so, and I can't remember the character's name, and what happens at the end. Like they are allowed to be vague, and that doesn't elicit nervousness from the industry, because I think that there's something, you know, built in. At the end of the day, a director is a leader. It's the pilot. It's the army commander. That's how we see a director. And when you think about a pilot, you think about the general, that's a man. That is a man with a baseball cap, and he is in charge. So I think women have to work harder to basically convince the decision makers that they can handle those pressures. So yeah, I would say, you know, kind of preparation, calm, and, you know, essentially building the trust of the people you're talking to.
Anyone over here? I've been neglecting this site. Any got a question?
How do you work with directors, and how do you keep them in line with your vision for the film?
How do I keep
In line with your vision for the film?
when I'm making a film? How does it stay in line?
Yeah, specifically with your work with directors.
Oh, well, I think in terms of making films, I really actually believe that there's 3 phases. There's the phases of the script and that making that the best that it can be. Then there's the shoot, where you're basically capturing, you know, basically the performances. And then there's edit, which is a whole new creative, you know, very often you throw out, you know, kind of what the original concept was, and you're like, you have all these pieces, it's a jigsaw puzzle. How do we make this the absolute best that it can be? And I think my job with regards to the kind of relationship with the director is twofold. One is to support their vision and to try and help them and create a, you know, kind of an environment where they will do the best possible work, but also at times, you know, basically be a voice, not necessarily of dissent, but a voice of a different opinion if you feel something is not working. And that's a very, very tricky thing, because often a film is so subjective. It's, you know, one person might think that something is masterful and someone else might think it really, really doesn't work. But I find often the struggle, particularly with young filmmakers, is around the length of the film, because they will, if it's a writer-director, they've written it, they've created every beat, they've shot it, they've been in the edit room for, you know, at this point 3 or 4 months. Every decision they have thought about, you know, we are doing this scene and we're going to focus on this glass of water for 19 seconds, and they have thought through the reason to do that. And then I will come in and I'll have to gently say, I don't know that an audience wants to look at this glass for 18 seconds. You know, I think you'll lose attention. And it's a struggle when someone has lived with that decision for, you know, sometimes years, from script to that day. I think in edit in particular, I find that the thing that really, really helps is screenings. And, you know, basically so you can do screenings sometimes just for, you know, friends and family, for, you know, 20, 30 people. You can do screenings for far larger people, a larger group of people, sometimes recruited screenings where you don't know the people, you're bringing them in to comment on the film. And the interesting things about screenings is they never lie. You know, when you have, particularly the recruited screenings, which studios do all the time, that's an expensive process. It's 300 people that are strangers that come in, but it's fascinating because you bring in 300 people, and generally if something is confusing, if something is too long, if a character they don't connect with, like, you know, basically the extraordinary kind of alignment that people have, all strangers in the room, and yet generally, you know, 80% of them will think it's too long, or 90% of them will not connect with one of the characters. And I think that's something that's really helpful for the post-production process, because then it's not what I think versus what the director thinks, but it's really like 300 people have spoken. We have to listen to that.
At the back.
Yes. Yes. At the back.
I'm in a unique situation where I've been very grateful to create a short film. It's going quite well. It's starting to look at distribution for the short film itself. The curiosity I have is we have a feature film of this short film to make, and I'm quite fresh as a producer with only like 10 projects so far. I'm trying to figure out the way to be taken seriously in the investor side of things, so they can understand I'm delivering a product that could be commercially viable, and how do I'm getting to understand that I'm ready to be taken seriously more than anything else. How would I approach that? And also,
Well, I find that it's often around, it's building trust in meetings. It's making sure you are able to answer every single question as a producer. So you'll have questions on, you know, budgetarily, how are you going to make this? You know, you have the budget, you're able to talk fluently through the budget. What's the production plan? Where are you going to shoot? Where are you going to do post? You know, just really being able to answer those questions. What's the distribution plan? How are you going to get the movie out in the world? What's the marketing plan eventually? So just really, really being able to answer all the questions. And sometimes it's also to do with, you know, when you don't know how to answer a question, let me get back to you. It's a really good question, and then following up, and just, you know, but just basically, I think it's for the investment community with a producer, it's, you're in good hands. You know, I will take care of you. I hear everything that you're saying. I'm thoughtful about all of it, and I will come back to you. For some first-time producers, and it depends really how simple or complicated the film is, but when a film is big and challenging, it may make sense to partner with someone. If a film is, you know, kind of sub £1 million film, I don't think, I think any smart person can handle that. But if something is, you know, big and ambitious or complicated, it might help to have a partner on it. You know, I think that's not a bad thing for a first feature, depending on what the feature is. And yeah, it's really all about building trust. And I mean, I think producing, at the end of the day, what producing really is problem solving. It's, you know, just problems come up every single day in all the phases, in, you know, kind of early conception, in development, in production, in post-production, in the marketing and sales mode. And, you know, just basically problems are thrown your way, and you just have to either know how to solve the problem or know who to go to solve the problem. So I think it's making your investor feel like you have what it takes on that front. One of them.
Hi there. I'm a new producer and a sound designer. I've got a really good crew, really high up in the industry, but it was a proof of concept film, and now like the director's giving me how much he wants to be paid, and it's all rising, and I can't. How do I negotiate with them to bring the pricing down of their wages?
I think ultimately what I try to do is I try to figure out how much do I have to make the movie, and then I try to do the deals, because I think it's sometimes setting wages, it's going to be a very different wage if it's a £1 million film than if it's a £5 million film. So I think just basically saying, let's put a pin in it, let's go and see how much money we can raise, and then when we figure out how much we have, the deal for you, this is for the director, right?
Yeah, and the other crew. So I've got.
I would first figure out how much you have, because ultimately.
I did say originally that I'd give them a percentage of how much I raised, and then they started expecting certain wages.
It's really tricky, because at the end of the day, what's happened in the last few years is it's harder and harder to raise money for films, so the budgets are getting lower, and then when the budgets are lower, crew is paid less and actors are paid less, and it becomes a difficult and unsustainable career for a lot of people. So I always believe in being fair, but I also think that you can't pay more than what you have, and ultimately what goes to paying the crew does not go on the screen, and you need to leave enough money to make great, particularly for the director. At the end of the day, a director, this is going to be, that is the person who has the most to lose or to gain from a film working. So I think the percentage of the budget is a good idea, and then raise the most you can, and they'll be paid proportionally.
And then try the finance advice you get. Thanks.
We could be here all night with Celine, but it's important for us to honour her time. So I've got time for one last question. Darren?
Where do you think most of your audience spends their viewing time?
Most of my audience, or most of the audience.
Platforms, technology, cinema, everything else. Like, where do you think people are actually watching content?
I mean, gaming now, I think is, just so.
About linear.
Oh, linear.
Film. Yeah.
Streaming. It's really all streaming. It's Netflix.
What about vertical drama, micro-episodic? Actually outstripped theatrical in China last year. Made more money than theatre.
What did?
Micro-episodic.
With like short form
It's where they take a feature film and they break it up into 1 to 2 minute episodes.
Oh wow! And where are people watching that?
Percent of revenues come from the US, and it's growing like pretty rapidly.
They're watching it on their phone.
Where are people paying for content? Because if you believe in giving an investor a return, you have to understand what people are consuming. And so where people are watching content, what is the habits of people watching content? And so you have to understand where people that want to watch the films that you make are watching it.
But are they paying for that 1 to 2 minute content?
Like it's making more money than the theatre.
That's great. Great and sad.
Yeah.
Is that, I mean, to tail onto that, going into meetings with investors, and is that something that is at the forefront of your mind? How am I going to return? As you said, it's not guaranteed, but how am I going to take this capital and give them a service with it?
Yeah. We've never done that. We've never chopped things up into 1 minute pieces. But what we do with every investor meeting is say, this is the plan to make your money back. This is the festival we're going to go to. These are the foreign sales estimates. This is how much we think we're going to sell this film in Spain and France and Germany. This is basically our estimates. This is what we're going to do for the US and the UK, which are generally 2 pretty big markets. And then this is how much we think we're going to get up front, and we think we're going to get these overages. So really kind of thinking through the return and building a model for them, and having it, having different scenarios and showing them what, and because it's so much about execution, if the film turns out great, you're going to sell it for so much more than if the film doesn't turn out great. So really modeling out those different scenarios.
Thank you. And to round everything up, we've talked about so much tonight, so much amazing value. Before we duly thank Celine, where do you see the future of storytelling heading, given everything we've talked about?
Well, I want to go back to this year being such a great year for film. I really thought this year the Oscar films were the strongest in as many years as I can remember. And what I think, and I also pointed to American companies that I think are doing an extraordinary job, it's A24 and Neon. And those are 2 very recent companies. They haven't been around for very long. And what they do is they look for really original films. They look for left of center, unusual, interesting, weird films, and those films are doing really, really well. And those are kind of brands that have emerged in the US where people want to see a film that A24 is releasing. And in talking to those companies, and I love those guys who started the company, they're young and they're dynamic. It's companies that are run full of young people, is they are basically looking for things that are not like something else. And in all my years in film, I feel like, so many companies are like, oh, we just did Little Miss Sunshine. Let's try and do a film like Little Miss Sunshine. So after Little Miss Sunshine, there were 20 Little Miss Sunshines, none of which were as good as Little Miss Sunshine, but it was very, very much, kind of, let's make something like the thing that has just worked. A24 will bid on a film if no one is bidding on the film, but they like it. And if everyone is bidding on the film and they don't like it, they will not bid on it. It's so much around their taste, they're contrarians, and they want to do things that are like nothing else. So I would say in terms of thinking about, kind of projects and stories you're telling, 10 years ago I would have said, find lots of comps, make it similar to something that just worked. Now I actually think for young people, if people are going to go to the theater and spend their time and their money on something, they want their minds to be blown and they want to see something really original and fresh. So I think, to me, and this year, awards films have really reinforced that sense of, kind of try and tell a story that is wildly original and like nothing else that is out in the world right now.
Was Perfect Days A24 involved in that movie?
Perfect Days.
The Japanese toilet cleaner.
I'm trying to remember who it was. I can't remember. Yeah.
I think it's Mubi.
It is Mubi, but probably a few people.
Mubi's another company that's incredibly original.
It's Neon in the States.
Is it?
Yeah, distribution. I think so.
I can't remember, but I love that. I love that film. It's great.
Definitely conversations to have after this interview. Can we please say a big round of applause? Big thank you to And just as she shared, she wished she could have been in a room like this. So talk to each other, help each other, see what you can do with each other and help move your projects forward. And hang around, grab a drink. There'll be more socializing and networking. Thank you very much.